So, good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to today's lecture on organisms and population. So, this is the first lecture under the unit ecology. So, before starting further about what are organisms and what is population and what is their role in ecology and in ecology, I would first like to introduce what is actually ecology or what ecology is all about. So we know that there are different diverse subjects that we deal in the in biology. So basically, ecology is that branch of science or is that branch of biology that helps in understanding the interaction between all the organisms. So it provides a holistic perspective to biology and helps in understanding as to how an organism being an individual having an individual identity interacts with other organisms and the physical environment, like for example light, water, soil around the organism which is present, and how the organism interact with those as a group and hence behave like the complete population, community or ecosystem, or we can consider a complete biosphere. So basically, ecology explains us about how a single organism interact with the other organisms that are present in its surrounding and how it interacts not only with the biotic components but also with the abiotic components which are present in its surrounding, and thereby how a particular organism behave and organize themselves into a population, community, ecosystem, and in the biosphere. So also in the ecology, we understand how the environmental changes affects the complete population. What are the what is the role of different anthropogenic environmental degradation? What is the significance and what is the impact of this environmental degradation on the individuals and how it affects the complete ecosystem? So, Professor Ramdev Mishra is known as the father of ecology in India, and he has done various important research that are related to the field of ecology. So, starting with the introduction, starting with the introduction about the ecosystem and ecology. So, what is the ecology? Ecology is a subject which studies the interaction among organisms and between the organism and its physical or also known as abiotic environment. So environment has basically two components. The one is the biotic component and the other one is the abiotic components. So abiotic components are the physical components, or we can say that they are the non-living components that are present in the surrounding. So the abiotic components mainly include, for example, soil, water, light that is present. So these are the abiotic components that are present in the environment. Temperature may also come under the category of physical environment or the abiotic components, while the biotic factors include the living organisms, for example, the animals, plants, algae, fungi, bacteria that are present in our environment. So ecology as a whole allows us to understand the interactions that are present among the organisms and between the organism and its physical or abiotic environment. So it helps in basically understanding the connection between the biotic and abiotic environment. Basically, there are four levels of biological organization in the ecological point of from the ecological point of view. So if we start from these levels, the lowest level is the organism level. Then we have a population. These populations then interact with each other to form a community, and these communities further interact to form the complete biome. So starting with, so these are the different levels of biological organization or the ecological hierarchy that is that begins at the level of the organism. So organisms are at the smallest level of the ecological hierarchy, and and these proceed to the levels of greater complexity. So organisms, that is the individuals that are present. So these individuals interact with each other and form a group, and especially the group of organisms of same species forms a population. Now these different groups of the organisms comprising of the same species, which is known as the population, now interact with each other and form a group of populations that may contain different species, forming a community. These communities then these communities along with the biotic and abiotic factors form the ecosystem, and biosphere as a whole, which is the greater unit, or we can say the unit with a greater complexity, is known as the biosphere, and it comprises of all the other levels, deep soil up through the atmosphere. So basically from the deep soil to up to the atmosphere, everything is known as the biosphere. So biosphere may comprises of hydrosphere that comprises of all the water bodies and the living organisms that are present in the water body. It might comprise of the atmosphere, so different layers of the atmosphere also comes under the biosphere. So this is the level of biological organization or the ecological hierarchy that is present in an environment, that is present in any ecological system. So starting with the simplest unit of organisms, it moves towards the greater complexity, which is ultimately the last result is biosphere. So from organisms, then we have populations, which are the group of organisms. Then we have communities. Then we have ecosystem, and finally we have biosphere. So in today's lecture, we will mainly focus on organisms. And so the first chapter mainly focuses on the organisms and populations, and how organism and population like how they interact with other abiotic factors that are present in the environment, and basically how the ecosystem works at this level. So starting with organisms and population. So what is an organism? An organism is a simple living single living thing, and while a population is a group of organisms of the same species that resides mostly in the same place and at the same time. So basically ecology at the level of organism is essentially the physiological ecology, and it helps us to understand how different organisms are adapted to their environment in terms of not only survival, but one of the other important characteristics is reproduction. So if we are trying to understand the ecology at the level of organism, we will mainly be focusing on the physiological ecology that helps us to understand how different organisms are adapted to their environment. So basically at this level of ecology, we understand the different adaptations that are taken up by the different organisms in order to survive or in order to adapt to their environment, not only for the survival, but also for the reproduction. For example, we have seen some cases where birds migrate. These birds migrate from one pole to another pole, or from different one environment to different environment, just for the uh, to find the optimal conditions where they can reproduce. So basically ecology at this level, at the level of organism, tells us how these different organisms adapt to the different environmental conditions for the survival and for the reproduction. We know that the rotation of our planet around the sun and the tilt of the axis causes annual variations in the intensity and duration of the temperature, therefore resulting in distinct seasons. Therefore, due to the changes in these conditions, and due to this factor, there are different seasons that are present and that held, and there are different environmental conditions that are present in the different parts of the earth. So these variations also together with the annual variation in the precipitation. So the variations in the intensity and duration of temperature, intensity of light, duration of temperature, annual variation in the precipitation. So what is precipitation? Precipitation not only includes the rain, but also snow. So precipitation can be in the form of rain or in the form of snow. So any kind of like variations that may include the variations in the light, variation in the intensity of light, variation in the duration of temperature, variation in the precipitation accounts for the four major biomes. So these biomes are desert, rainforest, tundra, and the last, so basically rainforest, tundra, and grasslands. So biome distribution, this figure shows the biome distribution with respect to the annual temperature and precipitation. So on the x-axis is shown the mean annual precipitation. Precipitation is any form, like any liquid or frozen water that forms in the atmosphere and then it falls back to the earth. So basically, precipitation includes both rain and snow. So this x-axis shows the mean annual precipitation and the y-axis shows the mean annual temperature in degrees centigrades. These are the different biomes. So the biome distribution with respect to annual temperature and precipitation is shown in this diagram, in this figure. So the way to read this figure is, we can see that in case of tropical forest, if I will start from the tropical forest, the mean annual precipitation is also high, which is nearly about 400 or more than 400 centimeters. And also the mean annual temperature is around between the 20 to 25 degrees centigrades. While if I look at the desert area, so if I look at the desert biomes, so we'll find that the mean annual precipitation is like it's scanty and less than 50 centimeters per year. And while the mean annual temperature is quite high, 20 to 25 degree centigrades. Similarly, if I look at the coniferous forest, they have a mean annual precipitation of maximum of up to 250 centimeters, while the temperature ranges between the 5 to 15, around 5 to 12 degrees centigrades. So this is how the differences in the mean annual precipitation and the mean annual temperature in any specific area determines the uh, vegetation, determines the animals that resides in that particular area. So this is the importance of the abiotic factors in any environment that decides the even the that even decide that helps in deciding the composition of the biotic components that are present in any particular area. So, for example, there are certain species of plants and animals that are found in the desert area, but those are not found in the coniferous forest or alpine tundra. So, depending on the mean annual precipitation and the temperature conditions, certain species are adapted to live in a particular area. So these are the different biomes that are majorly present, and major classification of biomes based on the annual temperature and precipitation in any area. Also, beside this, regional and local variations within the each biome also led to the formation of various habitats. So this is the like under the biome, there are many local and regional areas that further have a variety of different habitats because of the differences, because of these some regional and local variations or the some regional and local differences. So this figure shows the major biomes of India specifically. So the figure A shows the tropical rainforest, figure B shows the deciduous forest, figure C is for the deserts, figure D is for the sea coast. So all of these are under a bigger umbrella term biome, but basically these biomes, these different four biomes, tropical rainforest, deciduous forest, desert, and sea coast, have regional and local differences among themselves that allows the differences in the that leads to the differences in the vegetation and the flora and fauna that is present in these biomes. So these are due to the regional and local variations within the each biome. For example, we can say that the annual precipitation in deciduous for in desert is less as compared to the tropical rainforest. So therefore, there must be variations in the species, and therefore there is a wide variety of habitat that is present due to the differences in the due to the variations in their uh, biotic and abiotic factors. Now, what are the key elements that lead to so much variation in the physical and chemical conditions of different habitats? So, majorly, what are basically the elements that are leading to the differences, so much of regional and local differences in the physical and chemical conditions of different habitats? So, the most important ones are the abiotic factors such as temperature, water, light, and soil. So, the temperature, water, light, and soil of any place or any environment affects the different animals that are present in that particular area, resulting in different habitat conditions. And besides physicochemical, that is besides abiotic factor, the habitat of an organism also includes some biotic components. For example, the pathogens, parasites, predators, and competitors. So these are the biotic components that also affect the presence of a particular organism or particular species in any particular area. So the most important ones are the abiotic factors like temperature, water, light, and soil. But besides the abiotic factors or the physicochemical factors, some biotic components like pathogens, parasites, predators, and competitors may also affect the habitat of an organism in any particular area. And most important thing is that there is a constant interaction that is going in between these organisms, and ecology is all about this study only. In later classes we will see that how different organisms actually interact with each other. Their interaction may end up in a positive note, or it may end up in a positive negative note, or it may end up in the way that they do not affect each other. So the interaction between these organisms will be studied in the later classes, but uh, ecology is all about the study of these interactions, that how these organisms interact with each other and with other abiotic components. So there is a constant interaction between these organisms, and based on these interactions, habitat of a particular organism may be decided. Over a period of time, after like the organisms had gone through natural selections, they have evolved adaptations to optimize its survival and reproduction in its habitat. So this is with the over the period of time during the course of evolution, organisms have undergone natural selections. They have adapted certain conditions, or they have evolved to adapt to certain conditions for the survival and for the reproduction in different habitats. So these adaptations allow the survival of particular species in a particular environmental conditions. For example, if we look for the adaptations in the desert plants. So desert plants are adapted to survive and reproduce in the arid areas or in the dry areas where the temperature is high. So they have adapted in such a way so that they can retain some water in within themselves because of the scarcity of water in their surroundings. So they have small leaves instead of larger leaves to prevent the evaporation. Also, this may like these small leaves does not are not exposed as much as compared to the larger leaves to the sunlight. Therefore, therefore these adaptations help in reducing the rate of evaporation. Also, they like there are certain plants that are succulent that store the water in their stem and they're in the body. So this allows the so such kind of adaptations allow the organisms, desert plants, to survive in that uh, basically in that arid or dry areas. So such adaptations have been taken up by the individuals or the organisms that are that are present in a particular habitat, and these adaptations over a period of time have gone through the natural selections, and finally the organisms have evolved adaptations to optimize its survival and reproduction in the habitat. Each organism has invariably defined range of conditions that it can tolerate. For example, there are certain bacteria that can tolerate more than 90 degrees centigrade, while on the other hand, we individuals, humans, cannot tolerate, like our enzymes become are most active at 37 degrees centigrade and may denature at 90 degrees centigrade. Therefore, every organism, like each organism, has invariably defined range of conditions that it can tolerate, diversity in the resources it utilizes, and a distinct functional role in the ecological system. And when it comes to the functional role of any organism in the ecological system, all these things are known as niche. So there is a difference between the habitat and the niche. There is a thin line of difference basically. So the place where the organism resides is habitat, but its functional role along with the different conditions it can tolerate and its functional role in the ecological system comes under the category of niche. So, like understanding what is habitat and what is niche one by one. So, habitat is a natural setting in which a certain organism lives and it relies on its surrounding for survival, food, shelter, protection, and mating. So, it is the particular area or it's a natural setting in which a particular organism lives and interact with other organisms for like it is dependent on the surroundings for its food, survival, shelter, protection, and mating. The word habitat comes from the Latin word habitare, which means to occupy. The physical and biological aspect of an organism's habitat define it. The nature of the soil, basically habitat is defined by what factors? So habitat of an organism is defined by the biotic as well as abiotic factors that are present in its surrounding. So the nature of the soil, availability of the land, the intensity of the sunlight, what is the temperature condition, what is an annual precipitation, how much rain, how much water, how much precipitation happens in a particular area, and what are the climatic variables. All that comes under the physical factors affect the habitat of an organism. Food availability and the presence or absence of predators are examples of biological factors. So basically, organisms' habitat is defined by the various physical and biological factors that are present in any particular area. So, if I talk about the physical factors, then the nature of the soil, availability of the space or the land, sunlight, temperature, climatic variables affects the organism's habitat. And if I talk about the biological factors that affect the organism's habitat, then the food availability and the presence of predators or the competitors affect the habitat of any organism. For example, if I talk about the parasitic organisms, the parasitic organisms uh, resides under the host body. So the habitat can be the host body, or it can be the section of host body, or a single cell. Habitat does not always have to be a place. So basically, depending on the organism, it is not necessarily the land or the water or air that a particular organism lives. It can be even the body of any other organism, depending on the uh, host. Like for example, if I talk about the parasitic organism, it can the habitat is the host body on which it is dependent for its food, survival, and reproduction. So basically, the habitat can be the host body, complete host body, or it can be a particular section of any host body. It can be a particular single cell where the parasite lives, or like it does not necessarily to be a particular place. Space, shelter, food, and water are the four fundamental components of habitat. The ideal environment would have the right amount of each of these elements. So, if an organism has to look for an ideal habitat, what it will look for? It will look for space, shelter, food, and water. This is what exactly parasites do when they reside inside the host body. So they are dependent on the host for the space and nutrition. So these are the main four fundamental components in any habitat that determines the condition for the organism to live in that particular habitat. So these four components provide the what should be the ideal environment would have right amount of each of these elements. Each of these elements, like for space, shelter, food, and water. Have, so an ideal environment would have an right amount of space, shelter, food, and water, and would be considered as a ideal habitat. Animals and plants require different amounts of space to flourish, and the quantity of space required varies from species to species. For example, if I talk about the carpenter ants, they may require only a square inch of the area for an entire colony to build the colony and obtain the food. While if I talk about another string, quokkas, on the other hand, they are solitary territorial animals, like they move and like they form colonies and moves in colonies. So they require approximately 455 square kilometers of land to hunt and find a mate. So this is the difference in the, so from this example, we can understand the difference in the amount of the space that is required by plants and animals, or within, like from differences in the space that is required by different species. So a single species, like there might be some species that may reside in very small area, while there might be others that requires a large amount of area, that the habitat uh, is not limited to any square inch, but is indeed kilometer squares. So depending on the species to species, the area of the habitat may change. The availability of food has a significant impact on the habitat or location that animals choose to inhabit. So since we know that space, shelter, food, and water are the main fundamental components of any habitat, so therefore the availability of food that is present in any particular area or any particular location is very important or has a very significant impact on the habitat of any individual, because it is very obvious that animal will choose to inhabit the area where there is a availability of food. We all want to live in the area where there is a good food supply. So an organism or any animal would choose to inhabit the area where there is a availability of food, and therefore the availability of food has a significant impact on the habitat or the location that animals choose to inhabit or to live. Now this was all about the habitat. The next is the niche. So a species niche is its functional role and position in its habitat, describing how it responds to resource distribution and competitor or predators. So habitat is more about living in any particular area for food, water, and shelter, while niche is more about it a role, functional role, and position of any species in its habitat. So what role it plays in a particular habitat is comes under the niche. So the niche, like habitat, is determined by both abiotic and biotic elements in the specific environment. While if I talk about the niche, as compared to the habitat, on one hand, that is mainly determined by the individual ability to survive in any environment. While niche, on the other hand, is the result of a population's interaction with these elements and their impact on environment and other species within the environment. For example, if I talk about a habitat, so in a habitat, a population uses resources and breeds to create more creatures, increasing the resource available to the predators. Because it involves the interaction of creatures with the ecosystem, the phrase ecological niche is widely used when dealing with the living entities. So there is a very thin line of difference between the habitat and the niche. So niche is the place where there is a functional role that is involved and the position in the habitat that is involved. While if I talk about the habitat, so habitat is a place where an organisms live, survive, have food and water, etc. So Basically, since it involves the interaction of creatures with the ecosystem, we can call it as ecological niche when we are talking about the living entities. So a niche is an element of an organism's habitat. A niche is obviously, since niche involves the functional role of an organism in its habitat, so therefore niche is actually an element of an organism's habitat that deals with what it does to live in that ecosystem. So because niche involves the transfer of energy from one species to another, it is crucial to know how one species eats or interacts with other animals. So niche actually mainly deals with the interaction part of the ecosystem. So if a niche remains unfilled, it can be filled by another species. While this is not the case in case of habitat. So the type and number of variables that define an ecological niche differs by species, and the relative relevance of these variables varies by geographical and biological context. The fundamental niche is made up of all the biotic and abiotic factors that species use to survive, while limiting factors are the things like competition and predation that limits the population. So the competition and predation actually helps in limiting the population of the prey and the competitor. So this is the limiting factors that limits the population in any particular niche. So the fundamental niche is made up of both the biotic and abiotic factors, and species uses both biotic and abiotic factors to survive. While the interactions like competition, predation helps in limiting, they are known as the limiting factors as they help in limiting the population in any particular habitat. So these competition and predation are actually also very important from ecological point of view, because if this does not happen, then there will be a single species that might completely dominate over the other species. So therefore, the competition and predation help in limiting the population, thereby acting as a limiting factor. So niche are divided into three categories based on how species interact with the physical and biological world. They may be spatial or habitat niche, trophic, and it may be multidimensional niche. So the spatial or the habitat niche is, as the name suggests, is the physical area that a species occupies within a particular habitat. Trophic level occupied by species in the food chain or ecological chain is referred to as its trophic niche. For example, uh, plants are the primary producers, then herbivores that eat those plants are the primary consumers. So this type of trophic level, which is occupied by a particular species in the food chain or in the ecological chain, is referred to as trophic niche. The underlying niche concept and the limiting variables make up the multidimensional niche. So other dimensions so if I talk about the living area of a particular species, it comes under the spatial or habitat niche. If I talk about its position in the trophic level or in the food chain or in the ecological chain, it is called as trophic niche. And if I talk about the underlying niche concept and the limiting variables that make up the multidimensional niche. So limiting factors like how these interact, like multidimensional niche may involve the interaction between different organisms, like there might be competition, there might be predation that may be taking place. So all these comes under this multidimensional niche. So this, for example, if I consider spruce tree as a habitat for different birds, then we can consider arboreal habitat, or we can consider that this is the habitat for many birds. But in even on this single tree, certain birds have reside themselves to a particular area. So this is where they will come, they will make their nest, they will feed there, and they will raise their babies there. So therefore, they have decided their particular niche where they will have a functional role and they will perform all their functional activities. So this is just an example to show what is a habitat or what is a niche. So if I consider spruce tree as a habitat, Then Cape May warbler, for example, feeds at the tips of the branches near the top of the tree. Bay-breasted warbler feeds in the middle at the bases of the middle branches. So this is all about the trophic niche or the, sorry, this is about the spatial or the habitat niche. So all of these have, actually all of these have defined their habitat niche, and they play all, they perform all their functional activities in that particular area. So this was just an example to make you understand what is a niche and what is a habitat. Now we get to know that even in order to decide a particular habitat, an organism decides to reside in a particular area or inhabit in a particular area based on the various abiotic and biotic factors that are present in its surrounding. So today I will mainly focus on the various abiotic factors that are present in or the various abiotic factors that affect the habitat of any individual. So the major abiotic factors involve temperature, light, soil, and water. So we will start one by one with these. The first one is the temperature, and it is the most important ecologically relevant environmental factor. The average temperature on the land varies seasonally, and it decreases progressively from the equator towards the pole and from plains to the mountain tops. So if I move from the equator towards the poles, I'll find there is a decrease in the temperature. Similarly, if I move from the plains towards the mountain tops, there is a decrease in the temperature. It ranges from sub-zero levels in the polar areas and higher altitudes to more than 50 degrees centigrade in the variations in the temperature in only in the temperature condition itself we can see. However, there are certain unique habitats such as thermal springs, deep sea hydrothermal vents where the temperature may exceed more than or up to 100 degrees centigrade. So this is the range of temperature, like from sub-zero levels in the polar areas to more than 50 degrees centigrade in the higher altitude, in tropical deserts, to up to 100 degrees centigrades in thermal springs and deep sea hydrothermal vents. All these temperature levels affects the presence of different living organisms in these different habitats. The significance of temperature to living beings. One of the most important factor that why temperature is one of the most important factor in determining the habitat is the fact that we living organisms have enzymes. These enzymes helps us in carrying out our biological functions. So these enzymes, which are biocatalysts, have a particular kinetics of action, kinetics. So the kinetics of enzyme or the functioning of enzyme through which it carries out all the metabolic activity and other physiological function within the organism is dependent on the environment, because we know from the previous lectures that enzymes function at a particular, like they have a optimum temperature and pH conditions where it can function maximum. Below and above these optimum temperature, the enzymatic activity might disrupt. And especially at the higher temperature degrees, the enzyme may denature. Therefore, it is very important, so that temperature condition is very important for the survival of any living organism, thereby defining its habitat. For example, there are certain bacteria that may reside in the hydrothermal vents. Their enzymes may be functional even at 90 degree or 100 degree centigrade, but our enzymes will denature at such a high temperature. Adaptation to temperature is essential for the survival of the species and organisms. So based on how, like what is the wide range of temperature at which the organism may survive, these organisms may be divided into two types: eurythms and stenotherms. So organisms that can survive at a wide range of temperature are known as eurythms, because they have the ability to regulate their body temperature, so that, like, by different mechanisms, they have different coping mechanisms through which they can regulate their body temperature. For example, cat, dog, tiger, human. Mostly warm-blooded animals comes under the category of eurythms. So eurythms can be evolutionarily at advantage that they have adaptations to cold temperature, cold euthermy, are seen as essential for the survival of species during ice ages. In addition, the ability to survive in a wide range of temperature increases the chances or the species' ability to inhabit other areas, thereby having an advantage for natural selection. So basically, the organisms that can survive in a wide range of temperature, like for example, euthyms are an advantage because they can survive a wide range of temperature and thereby they can inhabit a like major areas, like they have the ability to inhabit other areas, and therefore they are an advantage for natural selection. They are on an advantage for natural selection. Euthermy is very important, and it is an important aspect of thermoregulation in organisms. It allows like how the organism regulates its temperature. Those organisms which can tolerate only a narrow range of temperature are known as stenotherms. For example, fish, frogs, lizards, and snakes. They cannot tolerate much changes in their in their outer environmental temperature. So over the course of time by evolution, animals of different ecological habitats have developed different variations and adaptations to temperature changes. And these changes or these adaptations enable them to survive in different habitats and develop the niche. So this is the diagram that shows the temperature versus activity of euthyms and stenotherms. So we can see that the euthyms have a wide range of wide temperature range where they can show some activity, while stenotherms have a very narrow range where they can show the activity. So this wide range have an advantage, or euthyms are in advantage due to the fact that they can tolerate wide range of temperature and thereby they can inhabit a different like they can inhabit in different areas. The second important factor is the light, and it is also an essential abiotic factor that determines the habitat of any individual. Ecologically, if I talk about light, the quality, which is determined by the wavelength, intensity, actual energy in gram calories, and the duration for which the light is received in any particular area or the length of the day is considered significant for organisms. Light influences the growth, pigmentation, migration, and reproduction. And the intensity and frequency of the light influences the metabolic activity. It might induce gene mutations as well. For example, if I talk about UV light or the X-rays, these these may induce mutations in the gene, thereby thereby sometimes resulting in diseases like cancer, and or may uh, or therefore it is very important that therefore the intensity and the frequency of the light influences the metabolic activity of any individual. Also, beside this, light is also, we know that it is essential for vision, and this is proved by the poorly developed or absence of eyes in the cave dwelling organisms. So we have seen that it has been seen or it has been found that in the organisms that usually resides inside the cave, where there is no light or where there is no scope that the light reaches to them, they have very their eyes are poorly developed or almost absent in those organisms. This is because they do not have the vision system much, they do not have a much developed vision system due to the absence of the light. And since plant and of course we know that light is very important for the process of photosynthesis, and plants produce food through photosynthesis, a process which is only possible when sunlight is available as a source of energy. Because if sunlight is not available, photosynthesis will not take place. This highlights the understanding about the importance of light for living organisms, especially for the autotrophs that makes their food only in the presence of sunlight. Many species many species of small plants like herbs and shrubs growing in forests are adapted to photosynthesize optimally under very low light conditions because they are constantly overshadowed by tall and canopied trees. Therefore, they are adapted in such a way that even in a very small, even in under very low light conditions or even in the low intensity light, they can perform photosynthesis. While there are many plants like that are dependent on the photo period. Like they need a particular time, light for a particular period of time for flowering, which is known as photoperiodic. So these plants are photoperiodic, that is, they need a particular, for a particular length of time, they need the light on, and then for the remaining, they need the light in the off state so that they can flower. For many animals too, light is important in that they use the diurnal and seasonal variations in the light intensity and duration as cues for timing their foraging, reproduction, and migratory activities. So we have seen that there are certain animals that become active only during the daytime, which these organisms are known as diurnal, while there are certain organisms that become active during the night time, which are known as nocturnal. So not only in case of plants, but also in the case of animals, light is important, and the differences in the variations in the light intensity and duration are important cues for such animals, that cues for foraging, reproduction, migratory activities in such animals. The availability of light on land is closely linked with that of temperature, since the sun is the source for both. So usually we have seen that more the sunlight, more is the temperature we feel. So this is interrelated because sun is the source for both light and temperature. So there are three terms that are related to light. The one is phototaxis, the other is phototropism, third one is photokinesis. So phototaxis is the movement of organism in response to light, either towards the source of light, as we can see in case of moths that are positive phototaxis, that is, they move towards the source of light, or the organism may move away from the light. So, for example, which is known as negative phototaxis, for example, in case of Euglena, volvox, earthworm, these organisms tend to avoid the light and moves away from the light. The next is phototropism, the growth or orientation of an organism in response to light, either towards the source of light, which is positive phototropism, as we know that in case of sunflower, or away from the light, which is negative phototropism, as in case of the roots of the plant. So we know that there are certain organisms that tries like there are certain organisms that orient themselves in the towards the light. This is known as the positive phototropism, for example, in case of sunflower, while there are certain organisms that moves themselves away from the light, which is known as the negative phototropism. So this was about the phototropism. Next is photokinesis. So for photokinesis, a change in the speed of location. Kinesis is related to the movement. So a change in the speed of location or frequency of turning in a motile organism or cell, which is made in response to a change in light intensity, is called photokinesis. It involves undirected random movement in response to light. So when the movement or the speed of locomotion is dependent on the intensity of the light, so this is known as photokinesis. The next important abiotic factor that defines a particular that helps in defining the habitat of a particular organism is the soil. Soil is a mixture of organic matter, minerals, gases, liquids, and organisms that together support the life. The soil zone is known as pedosphere, and soil is formed from rocks, which are parent material of soil, and by the process of weathering and erosion, this leads to the formation of embryonic soil, which is and this process is known as pedogenesis. That is the formation of new soil. It has four main functions. Soil acts as a medium for the plant growth. It is a means for the storage of water, and it also helps in the purification of water, natural purification of water. It is a modifier of Earth's atmosphere, and it is also a habitat for many organisms, which in turn modify the soil. So soil is formed of many horizontal layers, which is called as the soil profile. And there are different properties of the soil that actually helps in defining the soil of a particular area. So the first one is the texture of the soil. This is determined by the size and the soil particles that are present. The types of soil include sand, silt, and clay. So on the basis of the different sizes of the soil particles, the uh, texture of a soil is defined, and different soils can be sand, silt, and clay. The next is the porosity. So porosity is the space that is present between the soil particles in a given volume of soil. And this is called as the pore spaces. Obviously, the percentage of the soil volume which is occupied by the pore space or by the interstitial space is called the porosity of the soil. The next is the permeability of the soil, the characteristic of the soil that determines the movement of the water through the pore spaces is known as the soil permeability, and it is directly dependent obviously on the pore size. More the pore size, like basically it will be more permeable and allows the free movement of water. Water holding capacity of the soil is inversely dependent on the soil porosity. Less the pore size, more the ability of the soil to hold the water. So therefore the permeability of the soil is directly dependent on the pore size, while the water holding capacity is inversely dependent on the soil porosity. The next is the soil temperature. Soil also gets its heat energy from the solar radiations. These uh, lead to the decomposition of the organic matter and heat from the interior of the earth. So all these, like from the solar radiation, decomposition of the organic matter, and heat from the interior of the earth, determines the temperature of the soil. Soil temperature ultimately affects the germination of seeds, growth of roots, and biological activity of soil inhabiting micro and macroorganisms. Since temperature is also an essential factor for these micro and macroorganisms, so soil inhabiting micro and macroorganisms, biological activity is dependent on the temperature of the soil. Next is soil water. In soil, water is not only important as a solvent and transporting agent, but also maintains the soil texture, arrangement, and compactness of the particles, making soil habitable for plants and animals. So based on the porosity and permeability, it has the capacity to hold a particular volume of water, and that volume of water actually determines the texture, arrangement, and compactness of the soil particles, so that uh, different plants and animals can form habitat in that particular soil. The nature and properties of the soil in different places vary, and it is dependent on the climate, weathering process, whether soil is transported or sedimentary, and how soil development occurs. Various characteristics of the soil, such as soil composition, grain size, and aggregation, determine the percolation and water holding capacity of the soil. There are certain characteristics, like these characteristics along with the parameters such as pH, mineral composition, and topography determine to a large extent the vegetation in any area. For example, the plants that particularly grows in a desert area, that usually grows in a desert area, it's difficult or it's very hard that they grow you find the similar species in the polar regions. This is because of the differences in the parameters of pH, mineral composition, and topography of the soil. This in turn dictates the type of animals that can be supported. Similarly, in the aquatic environment, the sediment characteristics often determine the type of benthic animals that can thrive there. So, thereby, soil is also an important abiotic factor that helps in determining the habitat of organisms. The last important abiotic factor that we are going to discuss today is the water. So we know that the life on the earth began in the seas, and water is an essential component for the survival of all forms of life. So just like about 3/4 of the earth's surface is covered with water, and this comes under the category of hydrosphere. The soil was hydrosphere. For water, it is hydrosphere. For air, it is atmosphere. So water is found in three states: gaseous, liquid, and solid. And there are two types of water on the earth, mainly the they are fresh water and the salt water. So fresh water is present. Sources of fresh water are rivers, lakes, and ponds, while the sources of salt water are seas and oceans. Organisms that may reside in salt water, in the seas and oceans, it's difficult for them to live in the fresh water. While there are certain organisms that move from the salt water to the sea water, fresh water for just for egg laying. So these types of adaptations we will learn later. Therefore, we can see that water is also an important abiotic factor that determines the habitat of an individual. Based on the dissolved salts, water can be hard water. For example, if sulfates and nitrites of calcium and magnesium are present, or it may be a soft water in which these sulfates or nitrites are not present. If hardness can be removed by boiling, it is temporary hard water, and if boiling does not help, it is permanent hard water. So essential properties of the water that helps makes it an important abiotic factor for the survival is what is one of the main agents in pedogenesis, that is in the soil formation. It is a medium for several different ecosystems. It is present as moisture in the atmosphere and the outer layer of lithosphere and is uneven in the distribution of the earth. On the earth, water is heavier than air and it imparts greater buoyancy to the aquatic medium. This enables organisms to float at variable levels. Water has high heat capacity and latent heat, due to which it can withhold large amount of heat. Therefore, oceans and lakes tend to maintain a relatively constant temperature and the biosphere is relatively thermostable. Water is physically unique because it is being a solid, like if I talk about the ice being a solid, it is less dense even from its liquid. So water is considered as a universal solvent, means most of the uh, important components get dissolved in the water. It is the main medium by which chemical constituents are transported from abiotic components to the living components of the ecosystem. One of the important properties of water is that it has a high surface tension. This allows the pollen, dust, and even water striders to remain at the surface of the water body, even though they are denser than water. So this was about the different abiotic factors that we learned today. In the next lecture, we will learn about populations and different adaptations that these populations have undergone to live in a particular habitat. With this, I would like to end today's session on about the organisms and various abiotic factors that helps in determining the habitat of a particular organism. Thank you so much for attending it.